Masechet Yoma Daf Zayin, a pretty short daf. We're talking about this topic of Hutra or Dichuya Basibur. We saw last time, we ended up with a machloket between Rav Nachman, who says Heteri Basibur, and Rav Sheshat that says Dichuyahi Basibur. Let's review what this means. Basically, if the majority of the community or of the Kohanim are Tameh, and then Tameh Met specifically, then they're allowed to bring their korban even bit tum'ah. What kind of korbanot does this apply to? It applies to Korban Pesach if most of the people community is Tameh, but applies to communal sacrifices. If most of the Kohanim are Tameh, then communal sacrifices, tememet, then communal sacrifices can be done. It's actually kind of a surprising halacha. If you read the whole Torah, you would not think that this should be so. There's so much emphasis on being in betahara. You can't come into the kodesh if you're tamemet. So where did this whole law derive from? It appears all over the place. My best guess is that it derives from a time when people were tamemet and they didn't have access to para aduma, for whatever reason. And so now what they're going to do, they're going to stop all the korbanot of the Bet HaMikdash, right? The show must go on. And so therefore, this halacha must have been applicable and necessary at such a time. All the other types of tum'ah, you can always, you can solve. You go to mikveh. Mikveh is always available. But only tumat met, you need para aduma. And so therefore, if it's tumat met, and it's a communal sacrifice, and as we'll see today, it also has to be something. Depends on if it's eaten or not, right? That will make a difference. Also, something does it have to be that day, or is something you can do next week? That will also make a difference. So all these factors. Okay, so we're going to go to Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshat. What we're going to do is bring a few questions, proofs for Rav Sheshat, which is the same as bringing a challenge to Rav Nachman. We're going to have 4 challenges to Rav Nachman, then 1 challenge to Rav Sheshat. And we'll end up saying it's not only machloket amorim, but also machloket tanaim, and then elaborate a little bit more about the seats, the Kohen Gadol seats, which atones and effectuates that sacrifices that have a problem are still valid. Okay, so Rav Nachman, to remember, he says heteri basibor. Rav Sheshat said dichuya basibor. Let's remember what those concepts mean. Heter means it's totally allowed. Kind of like, I'll give you an example. Let's say Tisha B'Av falls out on Shabbat. Then you don't fast on Shabbat at all. It's totally permitted. You can eat steak, have a big feast, anything you want, right? Because Tisha B'Av does not apply at all on Shabbat. Rav Sheshat says dichuya. It's overridden, but it's still there. This would be like if Shabbat's in the middle of the week, whatever, and you don't feel good. So you don't feel good, you're allowed to eat, right? You don't have to put yourself in danger. But it doesn't mean that there's no Tisha B'Av anymore. You're not going to have a big feast. You minimize whatever you can do. Health is more important than Tisha B'Av. So you do it, but it's not that there's no Tisha B'Av, unlike Shabbat, when it's totally permitted. So therefore, they would make a practical difference between Rav Nachman is going to be a lot more lenient and say, even if it's just a few Kohanim, right? It's okay. You don't have to minimize. Rav Sheshat is go find some Kohanim who are tahor. Do whatever you can to do it betahara as much as possible. All right, so now we get to the first proof. Amar Rav Sheshat, Rav Sheshat, you want to know my source? I have a braita. The Tanya. The Omer sacrifice, that's the barley that Kohen brings on the second day of Pesach when we start the Omer, and then from the new grain. Now he's holding it, and it becomes, while he's standing there, he's ready to wave it. All of a sudden, a dead guy comes, someone dies and touches it, and now it's Tameh Met. Okay, now what are we going to do? Omer umevi'in acheret tachteha. Kohen should say, oh, listen, just became tameh. Go try to find more barley, so to bring it instead. I'd rather do it betahara. V'im en sham elahi omrin lo have pikeach ushtok. But if that's the only barley available, right, the rest of it not around, then you can do it bitum'ah. But we tell him, be smart and be quiet. In other words, don't publicize the fact that it's tameh. Why don't you want to publicize it? Well, because if people hear about it, they'll think that it's always allowed. And it's only allowed in a communal sacrifice, which the Omer is. If a private sacrifice, I want to bring a private mincha offering, and it's tameh, it's not allowed. But people won't understand the difference. So we say, be quiet and be smart. So he could still do it, but in a quiet way. Good. That's the Braita. Now, what do we learn from that? We see that you try to bring betahara. So that proves that Tuma is only dichuya. It's only overridden, but because it's only dichuya, you should try your best to bring it beheter. So that proves the opinion of Rav Sheshat that says dichuya. According to Rav Nachman, he should have said, well, once it's tameh, it's okay, it's mutar, it's nothing. It's like eating on Shabbat, which is Tisha B'Av. You don't have to minimize it. It's totally fine. So that seems like a good proof for Rav Sheshat. However, Rav Nachman will back himself up. Amar Rav Nachman, Modena hechadi gashiraim la'achila. Says, I agree also with you when the leftovers are eaten. The Omer sacrifice, as part of it is put on the Mizbeach, part of it the Kohanim eat. Now, they can only eat it if it's tahor, right? Even though we say tum'ah, dechuya, hutra, whatever you want to say, that just means that you can offer the sacrifice and it's valid. But if it's edible, if it's one that could be eaten, no one can eat it if it's tameh. And we'd prefer, if it's possible, to eat it. That's the only reason why the Kohen says, see if there's any more barley around that's tahor. So even I would agree, although it's hutra, so for the sacrifice itself, where that's validity, no problem, go ahead. But I think that's the reason why we go and look for it, because it's edible. So now we're going to look out for this difference, korbanot that are edible and those that are not. Like an olah is not good. So that's a challenge number one to Rav Nachman. Now challenge number two. Metibe hayam akriv minchat parim ve'elim uchvasim v'nitmet biyado omer umevi'in acheret tachteha. So now it's talking about other kinds of korbanot. We're going to have to define for what purpose we're bringing these elim, kibasim, and parim. But let's say the kohen is bringing it and it becomes tameh, met. Right while he's about to do it. So then he says, listen, I don't want to use this one. Go bring a different pot that's tahor. Why should you use one that's tameh? But if that's the only animal around, then we say, be smart and shut up, right? Just be quiet. Keep it on the low down. We don't want everyone to know that it's tameh. They're going to feel bad, and they're going to think that they also can bring it. An individual cannot bring any of these animals if as an individual sacrifice, if they're tameh, only communal sacrifices. Okay. This reminds me of what quantum physicists say. Shut up and calculate. Don't try to think about what quantum physics means. No one can understand it. Just make the calculation. Be smart. Okay, so that's the Braita. It's similar to the Omer. But now the question is, what kind of korbanot? My love parim, elim, uchvasim, dehag. Seems it's probably talking about and Sukkot. There's a lot of different kinds of animals. They're all communal sacrifices, and many of them are not eaten. So now Rav Nachman can't answer what he said before, that it's because the Kohanim want to eat part of them, so we look for tahor. Since they're olot, they're not eaten anyway. And therefore, there's no reason, according to for Rav Nachman, you say hutra besibur, tuma hutra besibur, there's no reason to look for tahor animals. It's totally permitted as tameh, and yet this Braita says you should look for tahor. That's a proof for Rav Sheshat, a challenge to Rav Nachman. But Rav Nachman has an answer ready. Rav Nachman is not actually saying this. We're answering for him. He could say, "Lo parim par avodah zara afagav desiburhu kevan de la kebia lezeman mehadirinan." The pod that we're talking about is not necessarily one for Sukkot, and it's an olah. It could be for avodah zara. He's talking about if the Sanhedrin makes a mistake. They make a mistake in ruling regarding avodah zara, and they say, this is allowed. It's really not. So they have to bring a pod as it's a communal offering. Now, even though it's a communal offering, they still should look for one that's tahor because it does not have a specific time. Unlike on the holiday, it has to be done that day. This one, the Sanhedrin, they're responsible to bring korban. They don't have to do it today. They could do it in 2 weeks. They could do it next month. So therefore, don't do it now when you're tameh. Wait around till the Kohanim are tahor and then do it. So that's why we try at least to look for a tahor animal. Elim ve'lo shel Aharon da'af al gav dekibia lezeman kevan deyachid hu mehaderinan. The ayil of Aharon that he brings for himself on Yom Kippur, he has to bring it that day. It's a Yom Kippur obligation, but it's a Korban Yachid to atone for himself, for his own family. And therefore, it's Korban Yachid, not Korban Sibur. That's why he has to look for a tahor animal. And the kebasim, bekebas haba aim ha'omer, dika shiraim la'achila. We're not talking about kebasim that you bring on Sukkot, but rather you bring kebasim, when you bring the omer sacrifice, you bring kebas with it. That is eaten, part of it, the leftover, is eaten by the Kohanim. And so now, for that, we can apply that same principle. Since we rather the Kohanim eat it, so that's why he's looking for a tahor animal. And so, but really, even though it's hutra besibur, each one for a different reason has a reason why you should look for a tahor animal. All right, that was the second challenge. Now, third challenge to Rav Nachman. Metibe dam shenitma uzrako beshogeg hursa bemezid lo hursa. So you prepared a korban, and the most important thing is throwing the blood on the mizbeach. That blood, if it became tameh, and you put it on the Kohen should not put it on the mizbeach. But if he does it anyway, b'di avad, what happens? If he did it by mistake, he didn't realize it was tameh, and he threw it, hursa. That korban is valid. The owner doesn't have to bring it again. The community doesn't have to bring it again. If he did it on purpose, knowing it's tameh, and put it on the mizbeach anyway, no good. Now, so this seems to be a challenge, right? According to Rav Nachman, if it's hutra besibur, then even b'mezid should be fine, right? What's the problem? So what? It's tameh. Do it on purpose. See, according to Rav Sheshat, that says dechuya, then it makes sense. You should try not to do it. You did it on purpose. No, invalid, right? You have to minimize, even though it's permitted, you have to minimize as much as possible. But according to Rav Nachman, it should be totally allowed. So Rav Nachman can answer, ki tanyahi diachid. We don't know what case it's talking about. That's the Baraita just talking about any case. So Rav Nachman says, no, it must be talking about Korban Yachid, and that's why you have to make sure it's tahor, at least b'mezid. All right, now fourth challenge to Rav Nachman. Tashema, al ma hasis meraseh, al hadam ועל הבשר ועל החלב שנטמע, בין בשוגג, בין במזיד, בין באונס, בין ברצון, בין ביחיד, בין בסיבור. That's the Braita. Okay, let's introduce this concept that the seats, right, that the Kohen Gadol would wear. We even have a picture here. All right, the seats he wears on his forehead that says Kodesh La Hashem. This has a special function which is mentioned in the pasuk. Here's a pasuk in Shemot that the seats will be al mesach Aharon, on his forehead, v'nasa Aharon et avon kodashim. By wearing the seats, he bears the sin of the holy offerings. So you see that the seats effectuates some kind of cleansing atonement for sin, problematic offerings, a sin that you have made with an offering. Asher yakdishu b'nei Israel lechol matenot kodshem v'ayal mischot tamid lerason. Lahem. So be on there all the time, and it'll be acceptable. So the korbanot will be acceptable. Okay, good. So now that we know that, what does the seats used for? What kinds of korbanot will the seats atone for and make those sacrifices acceptable? Well, it's on blood and flesh and chelev that became tameh. Chelev, right? That fat that goes on that is offered. They became tameh. The seat says it's valid anyway, whether it was done by mistake, unintentionally, or on purpose. Whether it was honest, which is completely out of my will, completely out of my forced. Ben berason, or wanted. Rason is really the same as mezid. It's just that the contrast of shogeg and ones are different. Shogeg means you were unwitting, but you are negligent. Ones is totally beyond my control. Ben be'achid, ben besibur, whether it's an individual offering or a communal offering. That's the Braita. Here's the question. If you think, as Rav Nachman, that Tumah is totally permitted when it's in a communal sacrifice, why do you need to tell me that the seats atones for, makes acceptable a Korban Sibur? That's one of the things on the list, is a Korban Sibur here, right? According to you, Rav Nachman, you shouldn't have to list Korban Sibur. Korban Sibur is totally permitted. What's the seats for? A Korban Yachid. If you did it, then it's okay. But you shouldn't have to list Korban Sibur. It makes sense to me, Rav Sheshat says, because I think it's Dechuya. So Dechuya, you really shouldn't do it. You should try not to do it. That's why, okay, you need the seats, and that will help you out. That's the question. Amalach Rav Nachman, ki kataneh asis meraseh ad yachid. Yeah, no, it really, you're right. It only should go on sibur, on yachid. The only reason we mentioned sibur is because you mentioned yachid also, so to have parallelism, yachid or sibur. But you're right. I don't think that you really need it for korban sibur. It's hutra besibur. That's one answer. Or I can even tell you, I agree. You need it for sibur, those that don't have a fixed time, like the one that Saladin has to bring, right? So it doesn't have a fixed time, therefore it's not hutra, because you could bring it next week when you're tahor. So for those, the seats does. But if it's a communal offering that you have to bring in a certain time, then hutra. Joel?
Rabbi, but if the fact that the tzitz is always meratzeh, any kind of thing, doesn't that support Rav Nachman's argument? Because then it's basically saying it's all good.
Good question. So the difference is whether you can do a lichet techila or b'di'avad. The seats is only if you did it in some problematic way, and now it's done. All right, you don't have to do it again. But Rav Nachman says if there's any tumah involved, it's okay, totally allowed, right? You don't even have to worry about it. It's like Tisha B'Av on Shabbat, totally allowed. Eat the meat, eat a drink, everything. You don't have to hold back. Zero. Okay, so that's the difference. Good question. Now, we're going to have a challenge the other way to Rav Sheshat. Only one challenge to Rav Sheshat. So regarding the seats, it says, "V'nasa Haron et avona kodashim." By wearing the seats, he will bear the sin of kodashim. V'chi eze avon hu noseh. What kind of sin is talking about? The pasuk doesn't say tumah. We have to derive it. Im avon pigul lo yeraseh. If you're talking about pigul, the pigul means if I have the wrong intention while I'm preparing, the kohen has wrong intention while he's preparing the korban. He says, I'm going to slaughter this korban and have in mind I'm going to eat it next week, past the time. No good. Pigul, very serious problem. Well, the pasuk regarding pigul already says lo yaraseh, so the seats can't undo the pasuk that says pigul is not acceptable. So it's not talking about that. Or if I actually leave it over to the second day, third day, depending on what kind of korban, and I eat it after its time, so it says lo yachashev, it shall not be credited. Doesn't work. So since the pasuk explicitly says that, the seats does not help those cases. So what is a case that's a little bit less problematic that the seats can help? Therefore, it's talking about something that was tameh, that it would be permitted bisibur, right? So hutra, see the word hutra, bisibur. So if it's not bisibur, then the seats helps out. So from the language of the Braita here, which says that the seats will help basically an individual korban yachid, that is tameh, and it doesn't say it's needed for sibur. In fact, this is the opposite. It says for something that is similar to hutra besibur, right? So therefore, you see that this is actually explicitly the words of Rav Nachman, who says hutra besibur is totally permitted. So Rav Sheshat, what are you going to do with that? Kashya Rav Sheshat. So his answer is Tana'ehi. Although me and you, Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshat, we are Moraim, third generation of Moraim, but the truth is that their machloket is just continuing a machloket that already appeared among the Tanaim. So Rav Sheshat says, you're right, this particular Baraita does prove your side, but I have other Baraitot that prove my side, right? The various Baraitot we said before, if you read them naturally, they support Rav Sheshat. So therefore, I have other support. I don't need this Baraita. You're right. This one does support you. Okay. How do we know that it is in fact a Machloket Tanaim? We want to find a Baraita that has two opinions in it that shows it. So here it is. The Tanya sits. Ben sheyeshno al mischo, ben sheno al mischo, meraseh divrei Rabbi Shimon. How does the seats work, right? Does the kohen have to be actually wearing it at the time that this korban was performed bitumah? So Rabbi Shimon says no. Whether the kohen is wearing it or not wearing it, it's just the seats existing. As long as it's there, even if it's hanging in his wardrobe, doesn't matter. It will atone for any sacrifice that is brought betumah. That's Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda omer odeo al mischo meraseh, and odeo al mischo eno meraseh. No, he actually has to be wearing it at the time that the mistake happened, that the tumah happened. Otherwise, it's no good. It does not effectuate the atonement and the sacrifice is invalid. That's the two opinions. Now within this braita, they have a conversation. Amar lo Rabbi Shimon, Kohen Gadol b'Yom HaKippurim yochiach she'en odeu al mischo umeraseh. On Yom Kippur, right, is the one day of the year where the Kohen Gadol changes out of his bigdei kehuna gedolah and wears plain white robes for any of the Yom Kippur avodot, right? When he goes into Kodesh Kodashim to do the ketoret and to sprinkle the blood, he's not wearing the seats. He's wearing only the white plain clothes. And so you see, he's not wearing the seats, and yet the seats effectuates. If it's done betumah, it's okay. So there you go. It's a proof for me that it's acceptable whether he's wearing it or not wearing it. Amar lo Rabbi Yehuda, hanach lechohen gadol b'Yom Kippurim, shetumah hutra lo b'sibur. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, I don't need the seats for Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is communal sacrifices, and therefore communal sacrifices are hutra, totally permitted, right? Because they are, when they are tameh, because they're sibur. So what do you see from here? Miklal de Rabbi Shimon sabar tuma dechuyahi basibur. Rabbi Shimon says, I need the seats, right, to effectuate tahara, to be valid, to validate korbanot that are tameh, even though they're besibur. So if you need the seats, that means it's the same as anything else. It's only dechuya. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, I don't need it at all. Even if he's not wearing the seats, and it's tameh, it's permitted because tuma hutra. So you see that even though they weren't talking about that language, they were only talking about the seats. From their conversation, we can infer that the one says you need the seats, the other one says you don't need the seats. If you don't need the seats, that means it's permitted on its own.
I thought they asked that it was also a personal. It was also yahid, not tzibur.
Right. Well, this is talking about the things he's doing for the sibur, the ketoret he's doing for the sibur, right?
Oh, so so it's not the rest of the korbanot.
Right. Not necessarily the things that he's doing as a yachid. The things he's doing yachid, yeah, then you're right. He would need the seats, right? But that's a good point because this came up yesterday also. Okay, excellent. So that solves all the problems, right? We had 4 challenges to Rav Nachman. He deflected them. We had 1 challenge to Rav Sheshat, but through that challenge, we learned it's actually a machloket tanaim. And here's the way to remember it. Rav Sheshat and Rabbi Shimon, both with a shin, they say dechuya. So they're on the same page. Rav Nachman and Rabbi Yehuda say hutra. But now that we're talking about the seats, we want to analyze where did they get their ideas from? How do we analyze? How do we read the pasuk? If the seats is broken, if it was destroyed, then everyone agrees it's no good. The seats has to exist for it to effectuate atonement and make it valid. So if it's broken, no good. The question is, when it's hanging in his wardrobe, right? It's there, but he's not wearing it. That's when Rabbi Yehuda sabad al mesach v'nasa. Rabbi Yehuda learns it from the fact that it says on his head. If it's on his forehead, then it bears the sin. Only if it's on his forehead. So since it has those words together, that's how he derives. It has to be on his forehead. Rabbi Shimon savar tamid ledason lifnei Hashem. Rabbi Shimon says the word tamid, right? Which means it always effectuates rason. It always makes it valid. So it's all the time. So you get by focusing on one half of the pasuk or another. That's how they derive their different opinions. Now the truth is that word tamid actually is going on dayam ischot tamid, comma, right? That's a pausing. That's a pause there. Tamid, and then it says lirason lahem. Rabbi Shimon's reading it as if tamid goes with lirason, right? Okay, but anyway, it does say al mischot tamid, which he's going to say in a second. Well, you can't actually wear it all the time. So let's see what they do with each other's half of the pasuk. My tamid, ilema tamid al mischo mimashkachat la. The word tamid. Well, in Peshat, it sounds like it has to be on his forehead all the time. Is that possible? Can he really wear it 24/7? Doesn't have to go to the bathroom. Doesn't have to sleep. He can't wear it when he's going to the bathroom. So obviously, he's not actually wearing it tamid. Ela tamid merasehu. Rather, the word tamid we has to be read with the next words, even though it's against the ta'amim. You have a zakef katon there. Okay, but They didn't have zakef katon. This is before they had the ta'amim. They had traditions of how to read it, but not nothing official. So you can it's a commentary. So he says no, tamid goes with meraseh, and that's why whether he's wearing it or not wearing it, Rabbi Shimon says it effectuates acceptance of the korbanot that are tameh. Ul Rabbi Yehuda nameh haketiv tamid. Now Rabbi Yehuda says the word tamid, right? And the rest in the bottom of the pasuk. What are you going to do with that? Hahu tamid shelo yasich da'ato mimenu kedraba bar Rav Huna. That teaches something else. That the kohen, while he's wearing it, should not divert his attention from it. Right? You should always keep in mind the seats. I'm wearing the seats. Kodesh LaHashem have to be holy, right? And not think about frivolous thoughts. Damar Baba Ravuna chayav adam lemashmesh bitfilav bechol sha'a v'sha'a kal v'chomer misitz. And this is a practical halacha. You should always be touching your tefillin to remind you, I'm wearing tefillin, so that you'll have them in mind. You'll have their kedusha in mind, and you won't think extraneous thoughts. You'll concentrate. And we learn it from a kal v'chomer. Tefillin is even more important than tzitz, an amazing thing. Ma tzitz shen vo'ela azkara achat. The tzitz has God's name only once. It's Kodesh LaHashem. That's it, only one. Amrat Torah mischot tamid shelo yasich da'ato mimenu. And yet the Torah says, think about it all the time, so not to think about other, but don't be distracted. Tefillin sheyesh ben azkarot harbeh alachat kama vechama. So tefillin that has Hashem's name many times, and Shema, Ve'ayaz, all those has Hashem's name many times, is even more important that you should think about it all the time and not be distracted. Okay, we're going to tomorrow we'll get asked the other way. What does Rabbi Shimon do with Rabbi Yehuda's pasuk? But for now, this is actually a practical halacha. Number one, this is the reason why we don't wear tefillin all day anymore. It's too difficult to be concentrating on the tefillin. You're in business, you're talking to people. So therefore, we limit it to only the time of tefillah when we assume, hopefully, you're concentrating on it. But also during the tefillah, right? When we mention the tefillin in Shema, the totafot, we actually do touch it, and that way we're drawing our attention to it, which is this is the source of touching it, so that we keep our attention on the holiness of the tefillin. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'Amen.